Minister for Housing, Local Government and Heritage to discuss the incoming regulations in short-term letting.
Thank you very much, Caoimhe. Look, at the outset, I'd like to just say that we should all recognise the value of short-term letting to rural economies. And of course, the government should also recognise, and I appreciate the work that has been done in this regard by our ministers that are involved. There are 1,800 short-term lets in County Kerry, which is worth over €70 million to the Kerry economy. If you take the Wild Atlantic Way, Minister, from Kerry to Donegal, there are over 6,800 short-term lets, all in rural counties across the West Coast, which is worth €256 million to our economy. I did hear Minister James Brown make a statement over the weekend that regulations around short-term letting will be amongst the most stringent in the EU. I would have worries about exactly what that means, because I do not want it to seem or to be that this government is attacking people involved in short-term lettings, because that's not what we should be doing. We should be, of course, doing everything we can to provide housing. But in doing that, we have to recognise that people that are involved in short-term lets and that have been established and that are doing it for years and years, they're providing a service in the local economy. They're keeping the local shop, the local pub, the local restaurant going. So then, with regard to the register is very welcome. The industry welcomes it. But the delays and the lack of details and clarity isn't helpful. There's nobody involved in short-term letting saying, oh, we don't want to register. That's not the case. The whole issue of planning is terrifying business people who operate in this sector. And it shouldn't be so, because of course what we should be doing, we should be saying, if you're established, if you've been there for a number of years, there should be a grandfather clause in place that those people, their planning will be the fact that they've been at it for a certain number of years. And that's the answer to that, and that would tick the box with regard to that issue. Of course then, who I have no sympathy for is if a person comes along now and wants to buy a house here in Dublin or in Kerry or in any place, and they want to change that house and make it into a short-term let. Of course, they can have the opportunity. They can apply for planning. They can go through all the rigours that we would put in place. And I have no problem with that, because we do want to stop accommodation going out of long-term residential into short-term. But it's the poor person who has been at it all along. That person should really, really be left alone. So, I mean, my main questions for the Minister would be that what does he mean by the most stringent regulations in Europe? I would see that as an upset, and being mild about it, a worry to the people that are involved in that business. And will the Department of Housing commit to publishing a national planning statement for short-term letting as soon as possible to be helpful to the sector? And will the Minister ensure that planning exemptions will be in place for those who are operating for 7 years or more? And most importantly, that those properties will be deemed planning compliant. In other words, the grandfather clause. We have to do something like that to protect the people. What about if you have a property and it's at the back of your house or on your farm or wherever it is, and you are not going to change that from short-term let to long-term letting? So, in other words, instead of helping, we'd actually be hurting, because we'd be taking a viable business out of a community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caoimhe, and I just want to thank Deputy Healy-Rae for highlighting this really important issue. I'm taking this, Deputy, on behalf of Minister James Brown. So the Department of Enterprise, Tourism and Employment has drafted what's the short-term letting and tourism bill. So this is a general scheme, and it's in full alignment with the EU short-term rental regulations, and that's what you're speaking about. So what we have now is a collaborative approach between our enterprise and our tourism. So the introduction of the STLT bill will provide a more effective legal and administrative basis to regulate the short-term lettings. So this bill, Deputy, when enacted, will provide the statutory basis for the introduction of a registered for all short-term lettings in Ireland, which will be implemented and managed by Fáilte Ireland. So all short-term letting accommodations providers will be required to register with Fáilte Ireland. As part of the registration process, accommodation providers will need to confirm that they are planning compliant, and that was one of the other issues that was addressed in this Deputy. Government has approved a threshold-based approach to generally preclude new planning permissions for the short-term lets in the larger towns and cities, where often long-term residential housing needs is significant. Further to this, the Cabinet Committee on Housing has proposed that the threshold be set at towns and cities with a population more than 20,000, amounting to 25 towns in the most recent census of the population. It is intended that the accommodation providers in all other locations outside the largest towns and cities will be able to avail of extended period to meet the planning compliance requirements. So this is all being led by planning, local authority, all different compliances, to ensure that there is a clear view both on a national level and a local authority level as to the overall policy approach to determining planning application for short-term lease. The Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage is currently, so they're finalising the national planning statement on the short-term lettings to supplement and support the introduction of the STLT bill. So the NPS will ensure a transparent, consistent overall policy approach, both nationally and at local authority level, to determine planning applications for short-term lettings that will be compliant and support the introduction of the STLT bill. It considers various factors such as existing planning legislation, the location, potential benefits of the proposed short-term lettings property, and the overarching aim is to balance housing needs with the potential impact on tourism and the economy development. The NPS is being finalised as a priority, and a draft will be brought to Cabinet shortly, and that was one of your questions, Deputy, and I can assure you I will go back to Minister Brown today to find out when will this be brought to Cabinet and get signed off on. Tourism is so important to the Irish economy, and the Government is mindful of concerns in both rural areas and in the major tourism regions where short-term lettings provide much needed accommodation for visitors. However, Deputy, meeting local housing needs across Ireland is critically important, and consideration with the Government must always be on the lever, so it's available to assist in providing homes for our people, including returning properties to the long-term residential market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Healy-Rae, and thank you, Minister. Of course, I recognise the fact that the figure of 20,000 was put in place and not less. I had lobbied very strongly for that because we want to protect the tourism capital of the Western world, which, as everybody knows, is Killarney in County Kerry, and there is no doubt about that. But what I am very worried about is in those areas and where the planning guidelines will be put in place for people achieving planning for short-term letting in towns and areas under the population of 20,000 and who are not operating for more than 7 years. Because the people need to see as soon as possible what is going to be put in place. I know the can has been kicked down the road a number of times, and I don't want to be fighty about that, but all I'm saying is that the people need clarity. And the biggest thing of all is that we're very clear on what we're going to be saying to people, that we don't want to hound or persecute fine, respectable people that are operating very nice businesses, that are paying tax, that have invested very heavily in their homes, in their accommodations, and they're specifically for short term. Where they're even located wouldn't blend in with long-term letting, because you could literally be putting two families in up on top of each other in the same yard. You know, Healy-Rae, exactly what I'm talking about. You have them in your constituency, so do you, Minister, so do you, Deputy, and you know what I'm talking about. And at the same time, as a government, yes, of course, the whole idea of do you want to stop places of having any long-term residential accommodation because everything will be short-term. Of course, we want balance, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Make sure that we're protecting established businesses and try and give clarity as soon as possible, not to be upsetting people. Thank you very much, Minister.
Yeah, thank you again. And Deputy, this is really an important topic. And I know the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage has worked closely with the Department of Enterprise, Tourism and Employment and is committed to developing a fair and balanced approach in the short-term letting question. And that is really crucial. And as you said, as a proud Kerry man, you have always highlighted the needs on this, and I absolutely agree. And again, it's about all the different departments working together, and this, I believe, will have a good outcome. With the approach outlined above, the need for rental housing stock is being balanced with the need to protect rural and regional tourism and jobs, and that is so important. So the long-term development of tourism requires that an appropriate equilibrium is achieved within the short and long-term rental sector. But tourism is so important to the Irish economy, and the Government is mindful of concerns in both rural and major tourism regions, with the short-term lettings provide much-needed accommodation for visitors, as you've spoke about. However, addressing Ireland's housing needs is a priority, and the Government must use every lever available, including returning some SDL properties to the housing market, which may include longer-term rentals. The approach to be taken to the short-term letting in the Tourism Bill, as well as the National Planning Statement, will have greater housing supply with the need to protect rural and regional touring jobs. And in conclusion, I would like to thank you again for raising this really important issue, and I'm glad to be providing you with as much information as I can. But the one thing I will say is, you're right, we need to get this finalised, we need to get the draft of this to be brought to Cabinet as soon as possible. And I will go back to Minister James Brown. Clarification is crucial here. Information and on what is happening going forward for everyone. So I'll absolutely do that. Thank you, Minister, or thank you, Deputy. Thank you.